Okay, thanks for being here with us this evening. I'm looking forward to being able to talk about a topic that actually really does interest me, and that's research ethics. It's one of the earlier aspects of the research process that I got interested in, but it's also something I went on to doing staff development with at AUT, for example, where I could share not only my knowledge of, but my passion for the importance of getting the ethics right in research. And the interesting thing is, it changes massively depending upon uh, what what type of research you are doing, what faculty you're in, and whether or not you're using human subjects in a way, but what your engagement with people is. So there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of challenges. What we're here to do tonight is talk about some of the broader issues that are associated with it. And what we're trying to do is look at what are the things that we have to consider as emerging researchers so that our research is both ethically conducted and ethically written, but also that we uphold a sense of integrity in what we're doing. And that becomes very important for us as researchers, especially as we move on and we develop. So let me start off with something that came across my desk just a couple of weeks ago. And ironically, it came from the university I first started both my studies at, and also I started my career at Auckland University. Interestingly enough, Auckland University's student magazine published an article not too long ago, actually, that looked at the fact that there had been research, um, almost Big Brother style research, into students' social media habits. And there was apparently a 60-page document that had been tracking random Auckland University students' social media behaviors without their knowledge. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about what the meaning of this is and what the ethical associations are here. I personally found it a cute reminder about the fact that, one, we do need to look at what is ethically acceptable these days, and two, the fact that research is happening about you without really you even knowing about it. And that was a big deal in respect to this particular case. So let's argue this. I'm a good person. Why do I need to worry about research ethics? Very simple. Let's look at what I've written. It's true that we can't do much about the bad person who is determined to do evil things. However, research ethics isn't just, or even mostly, about bad people doing bad things. It's actually about doing the right thing so that the knowledge we've got continues to be valid for us, but it's also about doing the right thing so that future researchers can build upon the research that we've done, knowing full well that it was done in a systematic and correct way. At the end of the day, it becomes our obligation to our community, to our stakeholders, to ourselves as researchers, but also to knowledge itself to be as ethical as we possibly can in the way in which we approach our research. I use the term possibly can because there are always going to be scenarios that we don't even recognize may not cross ethical boundaries, but may hit up upon them. And we've got to do our best to be as aware as possible about what that scenario will be. It is also about imperfect people doing imperfect things for a variety of reasons. We look at the fact that socially acceptable practice today may later be deemed wrong. That doesn't invalidate our research, but it does put it into question into the future. But we've also got to accept that across cultures, different things are going to be differently acceptable. So I often have the conversation. I've been living in Malaysia for a very long time, and a lot of the things that I do here may not be acceptable in societies elsewhere. So when I've traveled, when I went back to Australia last year, a number of the things that I think are quite okay because of where I've spent my last 15 plus years actually aren't. Now let's translate that into research as well, because sometimes we will view actually there's nothing wrong with it, but others will say, oi, actually you're crossing a boundary here. So, we make judgments every day, and we make judgments with our research. We look at things by accident. We may accidentally come across something, or we may do something that changes what we're putting together in our research or how we're putting together our research. That's something that we have to be able to address, but it does happen. So we accidentally do something wrong. Does that mean our research is not viable? Or is there a way that we have to be able to acknowledge that wrongdoing, but for the greater good, we actually continue with where we're going? We may look at the fact that we try to do shortcuts, termed here misdemeanor level wrongs. At the end of the day, everybody does try to take shortcuts, and we do that on research as well. A shortcut may be getting a research assistant to run statistics for you, and they don't do it properly. A shortcut may be, instead of using a stratified random sample, because we said we were going to, we use the snowball technique because our friends are so much easier to get the data that we want, even though it's actually not going to be relevant for us. That's probably more applicable at a master's level where we look at convenience sampling, but it does happen elsewhere. We look at, how do I fit something in? How do I massage something to be able to work so that I can save myself some time, or I can save myself some money? We might be missing something, especially with new methods or new technologies, we don't have the full picture. So in terms of that, the approach that we've got from an ethics standpoint may not be 100% spot on. One can become involved in research ethics violations through the wrongs of others. You may be part of a group doing research and somebody else has crossed that line. Or what has been done previously is like the first example, a change in social settings. So we view it as still acceptable. Or during our research, there is a very strong possibility that societal acceptance of certain actions may in fact change. And we've seen that with COVID. We've seen that with what's been happening in 2020. So there's no reason to say that that cannot implicate our research as well. Sometimes the right thing to do just isn't that clear. It's like the scenario, you see a person acting towards a child in a way that is not quite right. But you don't know as a bystander whether you should get involved or not. And many of us will become inactive or non-active when we see a crime or something inappropriate happen, because we're fearful of repercussions. The situation there is a real one, because actually it isn't clear. Without full knowledge of what's happening, you don't know the scenario, you don't know the situation. You're making a judgment call. Now, when we look into ethics and look in specifically to our research, what we've got to be able to figure out is, actually, I may not know. Should I use some form of very minor deception, for example, in order to get the outcome I want, because I know I will never get the outcome that I need to see in order to do my research without that deception? Or should I be honest and then run the risk that I won't get any research at all? So, we have to make these judgment calls. It doesn't mean we're going to make the right one. The guidance from our supervisor should help us. But at the end of the day, we still may not quite get it right. And the final one, which is interesting, is self-deception and other psychological tendencies. So in terms of this, sometimes we look and we talk ourselves into believing that it's okay. We drive down the road when we don't have a driver's license, for example. We tell ourselves that, it's okay to watch and take notes about people because they don't know that we're there. Or we tell ourselves that, what, just reading that document that we weren't supposed to read, it's all right, we'll get by it. This is part of it. Now, again, at the end of the day, our focus is now on choosing and thinking through, how can I be the best researcher I can? How can I be as ethical as possible? The lines are blurry, so we're never going to get it 100% spot on, but we do have to be able to think, how can I be as ethical as I possibly can? We also face a lot of professional pressures, and these things actually encourage shortcuts or worse. So the publish or perish mentality. Now, this still applies a lot to research students as well as it does to permanent tenured faculty, because we are expected to be contributing to publication, and our failure to publish actually has the potential to impact our PhD research, but also the potential to impact whatever we do into the future as well. We focus on it for tenure and retaining a job. Now, here's a really interesting scenario, because while most of us here are probably just PhD students, in a lot of countries around the world, and even myself, I was a lecturer well before I even wanted to start my PhD. So armed with my master's and other professional qualifications, I started lecturing and I had an involvement. But in order to keep my job, I had to be able to do research. And then there comes a time crunch. So the parameters can be different in that as well. We want to keep up with our peers. It's by making sure that I see some of my friends or colleagues within my department or within other departments that I have a connection to actually producing more work than I'm doing. So therefore, what do? I create a shortcut, I bypass something. I try to ensure something is heading in the right direction. So I may compromise on what is acceptable from an ethics standpoint. I have to look at securing grants. It's almost chicken and egg, because in order to make sure that you're going to get the grant, you need to, in a way, make sure that the research is going to be successful from that. And if you fail on one, you're going to fail on the other. So this may cause a pressure scenario for you. And another professional pressure is being the first to a discovery. I find that more from the entrepreneurial side than I do from the research side, but then my research is not exactly the world's most groundbreaking within a discipline. But we don't want somebody else to put forward the work or parallels to the work that we have been doing. So in order to make sure that we win the race, we may consider it necessary to actually breach ethics at times. Let's just start looking at what ethical principles in research are. Simply it comes down to sets of values, standards, principles used to determine appropriate and acceptable methods and behaviors at all stages of the research process. In simplest terms, what is right and what is not right. Now, we all have a sense of ethics, but that is culturally guided, that is geographically guided, that is experience guided. And it's also needs guided. So we've still got to balance how that's going to work. Let me ask you to stop and think for a moment. Do you know of any research projects? Doesn't matter if it's in social science, business, medicine, biology, architecture, anywhere where researchers did something that was ethically questionable. And what was it about the study that raised these questions for you? What did you notice that was not quite right? So it could have been something about a researcher that was utilizing somebody else's data to build a framework and then incorporating their data into that original data to be able to prove something, except there might have been a time lag. Or it may have been about a researcher who chose to observe behaviors without having any interaction with the participants or the subjects being observed, and whether that was right. Or it may have been about a researcher who invites you to participate in a study on X, but the real truth is they wanted to understand Y and Z and B and C and D at the same time, and X was never part of the outcome. All of these are simple, ethically questionable scenarios that might occur. And I think if we're honest, we can say, actually, we've seen many examples of these. I know of a former campus colleague from one of the universities that I taught at, who struggled to get the data to fit into his line of thinking for his PhD. And he simply manipulated the data to create the results. Eventually found out, didn't complete the PhD, certainly did not move forward on that. But it is something that professional pressure in this case caused. The reality of it happening is more frequent than we might actually be aware of. So let's look. Moral foundations of research. It is about doing good for humans, animals, the planet, future generations via the pursuit of knowledge. So it is our duty to respect individuals. We don't manipulate to get what we want. It is our possible duty to animals. Now, here's a challenge. Society at large has moved away from animal manipulation and animal testing for a lot of things. It doesn't mean that just because society has gone against it, it invalidates something we might want to do with our own research. But we have to decide, do we have a duty towards any animals that may be involved in our research? Now, I'm a business researcher. You know, I don't test on animals. I don't use them. Psychologists use lab rats, for example, mice, etc. I don't have that experience or that need, but I still can think through, are we going about it in a way that's in A, the best interests of our research, B, correlating to the best interests of the welfare of perhaps the animals that are being used. Most importantly, though, we have to balance with our obligations to society. You know, we are in a privileged position to be able to contribute knowledge to help others and to help society grow. That's, an element of all research. It's an element of expectation from the PhD. So in this case, we have to make sure that, we balance these obligations. Interestingly enough, the various obligations also derive from these particular foundations. And this is where tension can come in. Because, for example, our obligation to society is to help. But at the end of the day, if our research isn't uh, going or contributing perhaps what we hoped it would, we may find that we're under pressure to make adjustments so that it does help. And that's where we start getting additional tensions. Let's take a look at the broader principles of research ethics and how these are applied in an everyday research situation. Now, remember, as I said, I'm a business researcher. I dabble in more the business social science area, so I'm going to keep my examples to this. But the principles apply everywhere. We've still got to think of these as the key scaffolding that we have. First and foremost principle, no matter what the research is to protect our study participants from harm. So we make sure that anybody who participates is not harmed, either physically, psychologically, emotionally, legally, socially, or financially as a result of their participation of a study. So we don't go into a high school, for example, and segregate all the gay children out so that everybody else can see what that particular cohort is, for example. We don't put people in a position where they can be identified financially. We don't put people in a position where their legal status is compromised because of their contribution to what we've done. Now, we can see that in a number of countries at the moment, where involvement in research has political and legal ramifications from it, as well as simply just getting the information. It's our responsibility to make sure that zero harm comes to our participants. So even if we do something wrong, maybe we cross a legal boundary in collecting our information, and I'll talk about a very famous case study where this happened. We should never give up the names or the identity of our participants, because the obligation is to protect them right from the beginning. And I'll talk shortly about Lord Humphrey's famous research and what ultimately became a case study for social sciences in particular. But that was a fantastic observation. But also, despite the ethical principles that he broke, this was one of the principles that he adhered to. He never gave up to any authorities the identities of the participants, active, willing, and unwilling, of his studies to the police, despite being arrested himself. Now, that's important. We also have to consider voluntary participation and informed consent. So voluntary participation is the principle that our study participants choose to participate of their own free will. So this is not us watching them and them not knowing. This is being informed that they have a choice to be involved in the research that we are undertaking in a way that they can then say yes or no. And that leads us to informed consent. Informed consent is the participant is aware and they have given some form of recordable approval, usually a signed document that says. So let's think. You might, like me, I go online, I help researchers where it is relevant by doing surveys that they may have put online that they share in Facebook groups or through other networks. And there's always a statement at the beginning, or a good piece of research will always have a statement at the beginning: I authorize my participation and agree to be involved in, etc., etc. Every time we are engaging with human subjects, and I know it sounds like a clinical medical trial, but business research is engaging with human subjects. We interview people, we survey people, we observe their behaviors. Every time we need to have a record that they were willing and informed participants in that particular process. So let me give you an interesting case study. Let's assume that we are going into a high school. Who should give informed consent in a study involving students under 18? Now, in most countries, not all, but most countries, the age of majority, i.e. when a child turns to an adult legally, becomes 18. Some countries it's earlier at 16. Others it's later at 21. But let's assume it's 18. So who should give informed consent in a study involving students under 18? Is it the students themselves? Is it the parents? Or should it be both? If it's the students themselves, let me ask you a question. Do you think the students have an understanding of the mechanism and the meaning of informed consent? You know, there's a reason why police in many countries cannot interview a minor under 18. It's because they are not deemed to have the mental capacity of an adult, and therefore are unlikely to be giving, intelligent, maybe not the best word, but to be giving considered answers that are in their best interests. Let's have a look at the students. You know, as a 17-year-old, I considered myself an adult. In fact, I was already at university at 17. I smoked, I drank beer, I drove a car. I had my own place, effectively, as well. So I considered myself an adult. I certainly wouldn't have expected my parents to have to sign off on my participation in something. But not every 17-year-old had the same advantage. I look at some 17-year-olds today and I think, oh, hell, the future's bad, because they don't have the street smarts that perhaps I had at that particular time. But let's look at a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old or hell, a 5-year-old. They can't give informed consent. They're not old enough for that to be able to mentally process what we're doing. They're being led down the garden path in a way. So the students may or may not be the right group or individuals to give their own informed consent. They can provide consent on don't touch me, because that's something that society has evolved very strongly over time. But are they necessarily right to give their informed consent on a study about their grades, their school behavior, their achievements, their sporting equipment, their physical growth? Then it comes back to the parents. The parents are the ones who have a responsibility for a child until 18. Therefore, any informed consent should come from them. But as a researcher myself, I'm going to argue that I would want informed consent from both. Imagine you're a 16-year-old again, and your parents decided you can be part of this study. And every week they're going to measure your weight, your height, and other physical attributes, for example. Not an unusual study, by the way. You may not want that to happen. So it is, in a way, violating your rights, even though the people responsible for protecting your rights, your parents, have said yes. So I would always argue that under 18, it should be both. But then let me throw a spanner in the works. I started at university when I was 17. Wasn't the youngest person there, but certainly was younger than 95% of the other people who were in the lectures with me. I would have been absolutely mortified as a university student to need mummy and daddy's permission and consent to be able to be involved in something. And in my first year, I got involved in a research project. And in fact, this was somebody who became my mentor, became one of my very first bosses. But as a 17-year-old, I was being interviewed for her master's thesis. And the reality, if I had been asked for my parents' permission for that, I would have died of embarrassment. So we have to be able to balance things, and we have to think what is right, but we also have to look at what is the depth of involvement of the participant who is under 18. What is the potential ramification for them? And then we have to decide at which party or parties is informed consent most important. Let's look at voluntary participation and informed consent from a different perspective. Passive consent first. When a 0 or no response is considered as an affirmative consent to participate in research. So opt-out informed consent. You're agreeing by taking no action to say no. So this might be not stopping the researcher. For example, come into my tutorial room. We're going to have a focus group. If you do not wish to be involved, there is the door. That's passive consent. I can leave, or my participants can leave. So let's use that same example and go a little deeper. Are participants really going to be volunteers all the time? You know, we see on American movies in particular that you get paid $20 to come and do a psychological experiment or something like that. But let's go into the absolute everyday scenario that we as researchers may likely be part of. You know, the classroom. So let me ask you, have you ever been asked by an instructor, a lecturer, a tutor, a teacher, while you were his or her student to participate in a study they were conducting? I've been asked as a student, and to be honest, I've asked as a lecturer. So were you ever asked while in class to complete a questionnaire or participate in an interview, including, interestingly enough, course performance evaluations of both the course and the lecturer? The thing is, I'm going to ask you a question. Did you feel any pressure, or did you feel you could decline easily? If you felt pressure or decline, that you couldn't decline, sorry, if you felt any pressure, you weren't really a volunteer. You may have given informed consent in a very loose sense, but you were also somewhat manipulated or compelled to be part of that process. So are students in these situations truly volunteers? No, they're convenient, they're manipulatable. That doesn't make it right, but we have to ask ourselves, should we, or how should this have gone ahead to be able to participate? Or what extra information should students have had? In my case, I'm going to say it should never have been done in the classroom, because the moment you're in the classroom, you're on the clock. Students have paid for your time to teach, not paid for your time to do your research. So that itself is actually something that is an ethical blur area, because you're not using the time right in terms of what the expectations of one of the parties would have been. Let's move on to, is it ethical to observe people in public without their knowledge? Now, lots of research has done this over the years. This is not a new thing, and this is not something that, goes on without awareness. But is it ethical in what we're doing? It all comes down to, are we looking at trends? Are we going to identify individuals in our research? Or are we looking at contribution to understanding statistics and statistical patterns or numerical patterns that are involved? So it's not unethical to observe people, but we've got to look at, what do we do with that observation? How do we protect privacy? How do we ensure that, for example, observation doesn't become photography that could later be used? Those are the considerations that we've got to look at. Let's give a couple of examples here. We decide we wanted to study college students by letting them assume that we're one of them. So we go into a park near a university and we sit down with a group of students and start to make friends, and we tell them, or we don't tell them directly, but we let them believe that because of the way we dress, the way we act, the questions we ask, the things we say, that we're actually a college student as well. Or maybe we want to find out a little bit more about drunk driving habits. So we turn up to an AA meeting. Hi, I'm Craig, and I'm not ready to say I'm an alcoholic yet, but I'm just here to listen and to get a feel for this. That's actually observational research. And we have to say, is that right? When you misrepresent yourself, you're conducting an ethical wrong. But when you don't represent yourself, you don't explicitly say who you are, and you don't deny if you're asked, that could be a challenge to think about. We want to think about anonymity and confidentiality. Anonymity is when no one, including the researcher, knows the identity of the research participants. So we're observing people from a distance. That's fine. They don't know us, we don't know them. We're not in a position where we can identify them. No problem. The moment we're in a position that we can identify them and use that identification either to advance our research or to disadvantage or put those people at a disadvantage, then we have a problem. And ultimately, confidentiality is extremely important. Often termed as privacy as well, but not always a pure overlap. This is when no third party knows the identity of the research participants. So I might conduct interviews or focus groups or even a survey with multiple people. I take out of my coding sheet their names or any identifiable factors that would lead me directly to that person. I take that out of my coding sheet, I process the data, I get outcomes. Okay. My responsibility is not to let others be aware of who my participants are. So I come back to the study that I was involved with, the one I talked about before when I was participating in somebody's master's research. It was actually about first-year student experience on campus. We all use pseudonyms. We were talked about in the research, but there was nothing that could have identified us as individuals. The researcher, however, had records where not only we gave our permission for this, we were asked to choose our own pseudonym so that we were represented how we wanted to be represented through names or through alternative names. And that was asked to be in writing as well. So there was a record of absolutely everything. Now let's talk about Lord Humphreys and the tea room trade. Humphreys is a sociologist. He did his PhD in the mid to late 1960s. And he did research on homosexual behavior of men in public spaces. He's considered very groundbreaking because not only the research told us a lot of unexpected findings, but also because he's become a case study for both research methodology and has become a case study for ethics and what is ethical and what is not ethical. So he broke the ethics guidelines by actively helping people at the time commit a crime in public spaces. Interestingly enough, when he was arrested, rather than giving up the names of the people that he was observing, because he had followed them, another ethical breach, he had followed them to their house, researched their names through telephone books and local authorities, and compiled a database on people that didn't even know he existed. But when he was arrested, he spent time in jail, was prosecuted, I believe, but he refused to make the lists available to public, to the prosecutors, to the police. Now that's where he upheld ethics that were appropriate. Now he became groundbreaking in the way he approached this research. The purpose or the end outcome of this research is it helped to destigmatize community understanding of what was happening in terms of homosexual sex and public spaces. His research was responsible for re-educating police departments and saying, look, this is not a crime that impacts other people, as was initially thought. This is a victimless crime. So divert your attention towards crimes that have victims. And he succeeded in that. But he broke the rules along the way. I have done a video, quite an extensive video case study of this. So feel free to check out our LinkedIn page or our Facebook page. You'll be able to see access to that there as well. Let's look at ethical issues concerning colleagues and the general public. This is about honest reporting. Our responsibility is to ethically produce and report accurate data. So we might want to take a shortcut which compromises the data that we have, but our obligation is to our colleagues, to those who might be doing research with us. Our obligation is to the public, because future users of our research output are going to rely on what we've got. Now, in some cases, our data sets may also become public so that further researchers can make use of that as well. Let's have a look at the ethical dilemmas during and after data collection. To me, data collection is on itself a frustrating process, but it's the key to getting where we want to go. But we have a lot of questions along the way. Who owns the data that we collect? Is that us? Is that the universities that we're studying with? Is it the organizations that have provided us funding or a scholarship? Is it our colleagues that we're sharing a data set with, because collective research can still result into other options? Or is it a journal because we've chosen to publish early aspects of our findings, but we've used the data from our PhD research to inform that. And we may have sold or signed away the rights to that data. We have to ask whose interpretation counts. Now it's very good. Some of us are quantitative researchers. We plug our raw data into software like Minitab, R, SPSS, SAS, all of these options. But what about those of us like me who are qualitative and historical researchers? And our interest lies in understanding the interpretation of a choice of word, or even worse, forget the word that's used, try the tone of voice that is used during the interaction. We each interpret that differently, which may in fact result in a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of data, and therefore can shift, albeit on a minor level, but we still have to be able to look at truth versus constructed truth, alternative reality, alternative facts, and all these modern terms that come up. Who has veto power? Who actually can say, don't use this data? You know, does that lie with us? Or does that lie with our supervisors? Or does that lie somewhere else? You know, I remember when I was teaching and I was trying to do some research on the effectiveness of the program I was teaching. It was a support program for business students in their first year of university studies. And I had data, I had good data, but that was based on my own observations. It was also based upon attendance and feedback that I had got from students with respect to this program. I'm talking hundreds of students per year, but I needed faculty data. And faculty were okay. The School of Business was quite comfortable to give me data until I reached one person who said, oh, I can give you the data, but I don't like what you're doing with it, so no. Effectively, there was veto power in there. And that's something we've got to understand as we collect or as we design the methodologies that we're going to use and design our data collection. Who at the end of the day can say you can use this or you can't use this? What become our obligations after the data is collected? This is as simple as safe storage, perhaps a coding system where the names of the respondents are kept separately to the responses themselves, but there is always a correlation method that we can use. In what form do we keep the data? You know, I started my research career where everything was printed. Cloud storage was not an option. And I know that makes me sound old, but you know, we're only talking 20, 25 years ago. But it wasn't an option, so everything was hardcover. I know researchers today who keep everything on a tab. Cloud storage, no physical copies of anything. But we've got to think about what are our obligations. Our obligations are multiple. One, it is storage. It is keeping for X number of years according to what university policy may be. It is about how we identify respondents and how we keep details and communications with respondents. It is also about what do we make available to our respondents. So for example, if you participate in an interview with me, you may quite reasonably and have an expectation that you can have a transcript of that interview. And that could be an obligation. The obligation there, though, also becomes, what did you promise your participant in the first place? If you told them they can have a transcript, give them a transcript. If you told them that they cannot and they agree to that, no issue. But you've got to understand and appreciate that. Can the data be used against the participants? Now, this could be a legal question. So this becomes an issue. If you are doing research on something that is illegal, and there was a case in New Zealand a couple of years ago where a researcher was doing some gang-based research. And in the end, there was pressure for him to give up observational notes and other things about select gang members who may or may not have been involved in a crime. And it became a significant legal case because he was reluctant, and rightly reluctant. But let me ask you, you're doing your research, you see someone committing a significant crime. Is your obligation to your research greater than your obligation to community, or the other way around? So this becomes something that's not only an ethical issue, it can transcend into a legal issue as well. Will data be used on their behalf? Are you using this information to lobby for changed practices that will impact either positively or negatively their life? So that's considerable. And do researchers have an obligation to protect the communities and the social groups they study, or just to guard the rights of individuals? If you're going into any research that has some sort of collective society element to it, your obligations are not to the 1, 2, 3 people that you've been interacting with primarily, but your obligation is to the entire community as well. Again, this has the potential to become a legal question as well as an ethical question. There are no fixed answers. I can't tell you, data is always owned by you, or data is always owned by the university, because it's not. Every situation is different. And this is why negotiating the ethical boundaries actually becomes quite a big challenge for us. But it's something we must work through and we must incorporate into our planning. Making decisions to maximize benefit and minimize risk. At the end of the day, we are making decisions and we want to get the most out of the opportunities and out of the information data that we collect, and we want to minimize the risk. But we've got to make sure we balance that fine line. We need to, if we know our research is going into a very gray area that may have legal implications, we need to think about the consequences of doing the given study as opposed to not doing it. If there's a potential that your study could identify somebody and put their life or put their education or their financial situation or whatever at risk, then you may be better off not doing the study. As a researcher, I'm going to say, actually, it's not about doing or not doing the study. It's about finding a way that you can ethically get the data needed to analyze results to make a difference. So I'm always going to say there is potentially a way to go about it. Consider all of the options you've got, all of the methods to find that research strategy that balances ethics with practical considerations. You know, the likelihood of obtaining the data that you need that's going to be quality. There most always will be a solution, but it may not be the solution you first thought about when you're trying to get it done. And you have to look at, how am I going to go about addressing this in the methodology section? As you write about your methodology, you're not only talking about what is right, but you're giving almost a journal experience as to your own journey through methodology, because you're providing advice to future researchers who are looking at the same thing. You know, what did you do right? What did you do wrong? What should I amend or adjust? So that becomes very important, that you look at, you know, choosing and making wise decisions. Let's do a quick quiz. The following ways to do research, which is likely to involve the most serious ethical concerns? In-person interviews, mail-in questionnaires, observation in a public place, analyzing data from a secondary source, or content analysis. Now, I really don't want to give my answer to this because, you know, I could talk about this whole thing for an hour. But let's look at it. An in-person interview, you've always got an opportunity to manipulate and to misunderstand. There's always going to be an ethical concern there. How did you choose the person? How did you approach the person? How do you structure your questions and your tone of communication with them to get what you want? Do you lead them on? Do you use exact questions for each individual? Blah, blah, blah. Lots of opportunities for concerns. Mail-in questionnaires. So this might be an online questionnaire. It may be a physical form. You know, people still use paper and pen. So, you know, we're not that outdated. There are still ethical issues with it. Is the right person answering it? Are they giving the correct answers? Is the person responding more than once? You know, a lot of, especially the young researchers who have had zero experience, do MailChimp questionnaires. But the thing is, you can, as a respondent, answer the same MailChimp questionnaire 10 times. And they will think it as unique individual responses, when in fact, 30 responses to them may only be 3 people, or even worse, it could be less. Observation in a public place. What are we observing? Should I say, how are we observing? How are we recording? Are we taking notes? Are we taking videos? Are we photographing? Are we using these later on? Are we watching somebody do something that is inappropriate and therefore we are by default breaking the law, or we're becoming the bystanders who fail to act on something? All of these are ethical concerns. Analyzing data from a secondary source. We didn't have direct involvement in the primary source. We may be manipulating it. We may not understand the context of it. We may not even have permission to really be using that data set. Again, ethical concerns. Or content analysis. This comes down to putting our cultural and personal lens over something that somebody else has written, almost historical research in a way. Are we reinterpreting it the wrong way or the right way? Is our position valid? What was the position of the person who wrote it in the first place? Were they valid? Were they even truthful in the first place? So each of these 5 has serious ethical concerns. If I'm going to personally answer based on my own experience, A is the one that could involve more serious ethical concerns, simply because you have that face-to-face interaction with somebody. Your body language, your method of control, even the setting that you use has the possibility to manipulate the environment and the responses that you're getting from it. Let's look at a few other examples of research misconduct. Image manipulation. You know, we simply adjust an image that we get, that we have taken as part of our research, to be able to showcase something else. Now, there's a fantastic one of England's Prince William waving at a I think, from memory. Media took photos from two angles. On one angle, it's showing what he's genuinely doing, which is waving, or actually more like this. On another angle, it looks like he's just giving the finger. It's exactly the same photo. And when you compare the two together, you can tell it's exactly the same photo. The manipulation is not in changing the photo. The manipulation is in choosing the angle that gives you what you want to say rather than a true representation. There's another photograph that I've seen of, it looks like a kid running in terror from a soldier. When you zoom back from the photo and you see the original photo, it's a group of soldiers playing with some orphaned kids playing baseball. The kid was not running in terror. He was running to the next base because he wanted to win the game. But again, it's manipulation. Now, manipulation comes from physically changing the attributes or from physically changing the angle at which you're viewing the attributes that you want. It also can be about taking other people's diagrams, for example, processes or whatever, and adjusting them in a way to suit yourself, to suit your research. So that also becomes image manipulation because you're using graphical representation. It may involve mapping or GIS, geographic information system skills, and it may be simply adjusting something. Electoral redelineation and gerrymandering, for example, is a great aspect of image manipulation from a mapping or geographical perspective. We might have data fabrication or falsification. You know, very early, even before I hit university, I used to do market research as a part-time job, paid my way. We were expected to get, 10, 15 questionnaires done in the morning on a Saturday. And some neighborhoods you got were absolute hell. Nobody wanted to talk to you. So we would ring up friends, or worst case, we'd just randomly do it ourselves and put some fake name down. Now, as an 18-year-old or a 17-year-old, I didn't really care much about that. But when I look back on it, what was convenient for me actually was falsification of data for my employer and ultimately for their client as well. We can look at data omission or suppression. Sometimes we see outliers. We take them out because we don't want that to impact our data. Or we find an individual that doesn't go the way we want them to go. So we simply take out a lot of what they say. Maybe we focus on certain aspects only, but we don't give that holistic picture. Yes, it's our choice what we choose to use with each interview, for example, or each focus group. But at the end of the day, when we purposely take away the negatives, we are not acting ethically by giving a holistic picture as to the type of feedback we got or the type of data or information that we got. We have plagiarism, big issue here in Asia. Even the perspectives on plagiarism differ across the world. But this can be both direct or even gleaned. We might see research that somebody else has done and thought, actually, we want to go down that track. Let's borrow their methodology, for example. But that could have been before they had published. We might have met them at a conference and got some ideas. It's still misconduct. The moment we acknowledge that we have utilized or borrowed our ideas from elsewhere, it's not misconduct. But when we just take and then do because of that, that becomes the misconduct element. And a final one, which, I think we hope never happens, but it still does, sabotage. There are going to be people out there who are jealous of your research or who want to get there before you do. And they may, in fact, sabotage the research that you've got. Or worse, you may sabotage somebody else's research for exactly the same reasons. All misconduct. So let's go to a more modern approach, because all of these are research ethics that have been developed, or ethical principles that have been developed through the years, and they form the foundation. Let's build the scaffolding. So there's a number of things that we should consider in modern research. Now, this includes how we are using internet, social media, and other digital-based opportunities to do our research. Key principles include honesty, objectivity, integrity, carefulness. That's about us having that attention to detail, and openness about why we're doing the research, what the research is, who's funding the research, and even our own position from the research. So maybe I also get to gain something from this. We want to look at intellectual property, and increasingly so now, especially with the way in which academic publishing works and the use of the internet. It's not so much just about citation, it is also about making sure now that we get permission at every stage when we're using somebody else's work. Confidentiality, as we've discussed, responsible publication. We have to ensure that we are certain about what we write before we put it out there. You know, gone are the days where you go to a conference to test something loosely. You still go to conferences to test the field, but it should be a lot more solid now, because the rigors of how people are judging us and judging our research are different. We now need to think about responsible mentoring, making sure that those who are mentoring us, those who are supervising us, whether it be a direct or indirect relationship towards our PhD, but we want to make sure that the responsible mentoring is a very strong thing, that we are getting good quality guidance. Now, I'm going to do some other webinars where I talk about student-supervisor relationships. But in this case, if you don't feel that your supervisor is giving you what you need, or meeting your needs, or meeting even the minimum expectations that you have, then you need to work on that relationship, or you need to look at a solution, perhaps including an alternative relationship. You need to look at respect for colleagues, social responsibilities to the community, to the people that you're researching, to the people that are going to use your research. We are increasingly getting into a scenario of non-discrimination. And while as you may argue this has always been there, in fact, it's like an onion. You know, 10, 15 years ago, we're at the outside of the onion. Today, we've peeled back even more layers, and it's becoming something that is watched increasingly. So we've got to make sure that there is no avenue for anybody to say that actually the research you've done discriminates because of the methodology that you use, because you chose a sampling technique that bypasses a particular community group. All of these issues are ethical principles now. Competency, you know, we need to be certain that we know what we're doing. There's legality. Again, we have shifting sands. What is legal today or illegal today, a year ago may have been different. 10 years ago may have been different. If we look at, you know, where we started our student journey as an undergrad to today, so many things have changed. And that's something that we've got to look out for. But we've also got to look out that we are not crossing legal boundaries. that we are not putting ourselves in a position that we can either be prosecuted or sued for the research that we're doing. We want to focus on animal care. As I said, most of us, given who my target audience are, probably have no connection to research on animals. But that doesn't mean there won't be someone out there who does that we know. At the end of the day, our principles still come down to making sure that animals are not harmed in a way that doesn't, the greater good doesn't shine through. And human subject protection, the anonymity, confidentiality, and so forth. You know, we can look at it from a different perspective as well. We don't want to cause discomfort to our research subjects by asking them questions. So that's something, you know, if you know that you're going to ask intense questions, what safety nets do you put in place? Will you offer counseling? Will you offer a debriefing session? You know, how do you address the fact that even with informed consent, you still may have a situation that a respondent could feel uncomfortable and need some sort of additional support afterwards? It's your responsibility to put that in place. We also have the situation of ethics approval, and I wasn't really going to talk about this today per se because it's a huge area. But let's just say every university has rules and guidelines on how to get ethics approval. You need to look at both the university guidelines, then specifically your faculty guidelines, and any specific requirements for your department individually. And then you've got to make sure you follow those. Because unless your research is approved through an ethics committee, your research may not be allowed to progress, or worse still, you go and do some research and then you submit for ethics approval afterwards. There is a chance that it may be rejected, and then the research that you've done has simply gone to waste. So what I've tried to do in today's webinar is talk about some of the key issues about research ethics and integrity along our journey. But I'm trying to do it not only from the PhD student's perspective, but from the broader research perspective, because ethics applies whether you're a master's student, postgrad diploma student, PhD student, lecturer, or faculty. The same principles are there. It comes down to our judgment. It comes down to what should we do and how should we think about it, so that ultimately what our research contributes to society is robust and strong. Future researchers may challenge it, but they should challenge the findings, not the processes or the ethics of how you got those findings in the first place. I'm going to wrap up for here. I'm happy to hand back over if there's any questions, and then I'll address them. Thank you very much. Hope I will get to see you guys at future webinars as well. Thank you.